He ruled New York's deadliest syndicate in absolute silence. Gabriel Moretti was born profoundly deaf, relying entirely on the vibration of a gunshot to know a man was dead. He thought he was untouchable in his quiet world until the new Maid pulled out an object that shattered his lifelong silence. To understand the sheer terror that Gabriel Moretti inspired, you have to understand the anatomy of his world. It was a world devoid of sirens, devoid of the agonizing screams of his enemies, and devoid of the hollow promises of his associates. Gabriel was born with bilateral severe sensorineural hearing loss. His auditory nerves were considered irreparably dormant by the top specialists at Mount Sinai Hospital. Dr. Harrison Caldwell, one of the most renowned neurootologists on the East Coast, had definitively stated in Gabriel's medical file that no cochlear implant, no surgery, and no amount of money could ever grant him the gift of sound. But Gabriel didn't need sound to build an empire. He turned his silence into a weapon. Sitting at the head of a massive mahogany table in his Tribeca penthouse, Gabriel watched the men around him. He didn't just look at them. He dissected them, without the distraction of noise. His eyes caught the micro-expressions that sound often masked. He saw the slight tremble in his capo's jaw, the nervous twitch in the accountant's left eye, the way a man's throat swallowed dryly before delivering a lie. Gabriel was a master lip reader, fluent in English, Italian, and Russian. You couldn't whisper behind his back because if he had a line of sight to your mouth, he possessed your secrets. His penthouse was meticulously engineered for a deaf apex predator. The floors were laid with imported Italian Calicata marble, chosen not just for its aesthetic, but for its density. The marble acted as a massive acoustic sounding board. Through the soles of his custom-made Berluti Oxfords, Gabriel could feel the heavy, thudding footsteps of his bodyguard, Silas, or the lighter, hesitant steps of his staff. He knew when a door opened by the shift in air pressure. He knew a gun was fired by the sudden, sharp shockwave that punched through the floorboards. Into this carefully calibrated ecosystem stepped Cameron Bennett. Cameron was hired through the premier Sterling Domestic Agency, an elite firm that provided discreet staff to Manhattan's billionaires. On paper, she was a 26-year-old hospitality expert from Portland, Oregon, with glowing recommendations from old money estates in the Hamptons. She was quiet, kept her head down, and understood the golden rule of the Moretti household: never approach the boss from behind, and never, under any circumstances, use sign language. Gabriel found American Sign Language to be a crutch. He forced the world to speak his language face to face, mouth unshadowed, completely exposed. From her very first week, Cameron was an anomaly. Most of the staff walked on eggshells, their steps rigid with fear, vibrating through the marble like erratic drumbeats. Cameron, however, moved like a ghost. She wore soft-soled shoes that barely registered on Gabriel's tactile radar. At first, this infuriated him. He liked to know where everyone was at all times. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Gabriel was in his study, going over the ledger of a particularly problematic shipment at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. He was deeply focused, the ambient vibrations of the New York thunderstorms barely registering against the thick, soundproofed glass of his floor-to-ceiling windows. Suddenly, a shadow fell over his desk. Gabriel's hand shot instinctively to the customized Kimber 1911 strapped beneath his desk. He looked up, his dark eyes flashing with lethal intent. It was Cameron. She stood there, perfectly still, holding a silver tray bearing a cup of black coffee. She hadn't startled. She didn't drop the tray when he glared at her. She simply met his eyes, her expression infuriatingly calm. Gabriel's jaw tightened. He watched her lips closely as she spoke. "I knocked," she said, her articulation slow and deliberate, perfectly tailored for a lip reader. "But the storm is masking the vibrations of the door. I apologize for startling you, Mr. Moretti." Gabriel didn't relax his grip on his weapon. He scrutinized her. There was something unnerving about the way she looked at him. It wasn't the usual blend of awe and terror he was accustomed to. It was analytical, clinical, even. She placed the tray down on the edge of the desk. Beside the porcelain cup was a folded piece of paper. Gabriel tapped the desk, a sharp, commanding rhythm that his men knew meant, "Explain." "A delivery," Cameron said, her lips moving with precise clarity. It bypassed the front desk. The courier insisted it was a personal matter. Gabriel dismissed her with a wave of his hand. As she turned to leave, he watched her posture. It was straight, confident, too confident for a maid. He reached for the paper, unfolding it. It was a photocopy of an old blueprint, not a building, but a schematic of a human skull, specifically the temporal bone. In the margins, written in a frantic, scrawled handwriting, was a chemical formula and a series of radio frequencies. Gabriel's blood ran cold. He knew that handwriting. It belonged to Dr. Arthur Bennett, the rogue biomedical engineer who had vanished 12 years ago after allegedly stealing millions from the Moretti Syndicate's pharmaceutical fronts. He slammed his fist on the desk, the vibration summoning Silas from the hallway in seconds. Gabriel pointed at the door, then signed sharply to Silas, a rare break in his rule. Bring the maid back. Now. But when Silas returned 3 minutes later, he was out of breath. He tapped his chest, then signed back. She's gone. Her room is empty. Gabriel stood up, walking over to the window. The city below was a blur of rain and gray clouds. A maid didn't just bypass a multi-million-dollar security system. A maid didn't just deliver a ghost from the past. Cameron Bennett wasn't here to clean. She was here to finish something. And for the first time in a decade, the silent king of New York felt completely blind. The hunt for Cameron Bennett consumed Gabriel for 48 hours. He mobilized his entire network, locking down airports, train stations, and the private helipads scattered across the tri-state area. His lieutenants tore through the sterling domestic agency, discovering that the background check, the Hamptons references, even the social security number attached to Cameron's file were masterfully fabricated. It was a ghost profile, constructed with the kind of digital sophistication usually reserved for federal intelligence agencies. Gabriel's frustration mounted, turning his silent world into a pressure cooker of paranoia. He couldn't sleep. The schematic of the temporal bone sat on his desk, a mocking reminder of his vulnerability. Dr. Arthur Bennett had been commissioned by Gabriel's late father, Don Vincenzo Moretti, to do the impossible, cure his son's deafness. The old Don had poured tens of millions into Bennett's clandestine research, but Bennett had gone rogue, claiming the technology was too dangerous, too invasive. He destroyed his lab and vanished, earning a death sentence from the Moretti family. Now, his ghost had returned, carried by a maid who moved without sound. On the third night, Gabriel was alone in the penthouse. He had sent his security detail down to the lobby, needing the absolute, undisturbed vibration of the empty apartment to think clearly. He poured himself a glass of Macallan 25, the heavy crystal tumbler cool against his palm. He walked toward his private gallery, a long corridor adorned with Renaissance art. Halfway down the hall, Gabriel stopped. He didn't hear a footstep. He didn't see a shadow. He felt it. The ambient air pressure in the hallway had shifted infinitesimally. A draft, coming from the direction of his master bedroom. He set the glass down on a side table. He didn't reach for his gun this time. He reached for the sleek ceramic combat knife he kept concealed in the lining of his tailored jacket. He moved down the hall, letting the shadows swallow him. He pushed open the heavy oak door of his bedroom. The room was bathed in the pale moonlight filtering through the skylight. Sitting casually on the edge of his unmade, king-sized bed was Cameron. She wasn't wearing her uniform. She was dressed in dark tactical clothing, her hair pulled back tightly. Beside her on the mattress was a small, brushed steel briefcase. Gabriel stepped fully into the room, the knife gleaming in his hand. He stepped heavily on the hardwood floor, a deliberate, threatening vibration to let her know she was trapped. Cameron didn't flinch. She looked up, the moonlight catching her eyes. She didn't look afraid. She looked exhausted. Gabriel raised his free hand, demanding answers through aggressive, sharp gestures, silently asking, "Who are you?" "I told you," she spoke aloud, ensuring the room's ambient light illuminated her lips perfectly. "I am Cameron Bennett. Dr. Arthur Bennett was my father." Gabriel froze. His mind raced. Bennett had a daughter? The files never mentioned a child. "Your father," Cameron continued, her lips forming the words with a slow, agonizing precision, "didn't steal the money. And he didn't destroy the research because it was dangerous. He destroyed the lab because your father ordered him to weaponize it. Vincenzo Moretti didn't just want to cure your hearing, Gabriel. He wanted my father to create a neural bridge that could transmit frequencies directly into the human brain, to bypass the ears entirely and send commands, pain, or sonic disruptions straight to the cortex. He wanted a weapon. Gabriel gripped the knife tighter. He shook his head, refusing to believe it. Vincenzo was a monster, yes, but everything he did, he claimed, was for his son. My father hid me, Cameron said, standing up slowly. She kept her hands open, palms facing Gabriel to show she was unarmed. And he hid the prototype. He spent the last 10 years of his life perfecting it for its original purpose. For you, he died a month ago from pancreatic cancer. His dying wish was for me to finish his work. Gabriel stared at her. He lowered the knife slightly, but his eyes remained deadly. He gestured sharply toward the briefcase. Cameron turned and unlatched the steel case. Inside, resting on a bed of molded foam, was something that looked like a sleek, metallic earpiece, but far more complex. It was a network of microwiring attached to a curved, titanium node. You don't have a severed auditory nerve, Gabriel, Cameron said, turning back to him holding the device. Your father lied to you. Dr. Caldwell at Mount Sinai lied to you. They kept you deaf because Vincenzo believed a silent heir was an observant, ruthless heir. He wanted you paranoid. He wanted you dependent. The words hit Gabriel like physical blows. He stepped back, his chest heaving. The betrayal was staggering, acidic. His own father, his doctors, his entire life of silence, orchestrated. This, Cameron held up the device, her hands trembling slightly, is a neuroacoustic transducer. It bypasses the tympanic membrane and the cochlea entirely. It bridges directly to your temporal lobe through bone conduction and microelectric pulses. It was calibrated exclusively to your DNA and bone density using the medical files my father stole when he fled. Gabriel looked from her lips to the device. The sheer audacity of the claim was insane. Yet, the conviction in her eyes was unwavering. He was Gabriel Moretti, the silent executioner of the underworld. He didn't take leaps of faith. But the hollow ache of his silent world, the lifelong yearning just to know the sound of his own breath, waged war against his paranoia. He walked slowly toward her. He towered over her, his presence suffocating in the quiet room. He tossed the ceramic knife onto the bed. He pointed to his own head, a silent command. Show me. Cameron swallowed hard. She stepped into his personal space. Gabriel tensed as she reached up. Her fingers were cold against his skin. She placed the curved titanium node against the mastoid bone behind his right ear. It felt heavy, cold, and strange. She adjusted a tiny adhesive patch that stuck to the base of his neck, connecting a hair-thin wire. It will be overwhelming at first, she warned, her lips moving inches from his face. Your brain has never processed auditory data like this. It's going to translate electrical signals into sound. Gabriel gave a sharp, impatient nod. Do it. Cameron reached into her pocket and pulled out a small remote. She locked eyes with him, taking a deep breath. She pressed the button. At first, there was nothing. Then, a sharp, electric hum vibrated through Gabriel's skull, making his teeth ache. He squeezed his eyes shut, his hands balling into fists. The vibration intensified, no longer just a feeling, but a pressure building inside his mind. And then, the pressure shattered. It wasn't a feeling, it was a presence. A rush of sensory information flooded his brain, chaotic, terrifying, and beautiful. He gasped, stumbling backward, his hands flying to the side of his head. Whoosh! Thump thump! Whoosh! Thump thump! He stared at Cameron in wide-eyed terror. What was that rapid, frantic rhythm? He pressed a hand to his chest. It was his own heartbeat. He was hearing his own heartbeat. Then came a soft, rhythmic patter against the skylight above. The rain. It wasn't just a vibration on the glass anymore. It was a symphony of 1,000 tiny drums. Gabriel fell to his knees, utterly overwhelmed. The silent fortress he had lived in for 30 years had been obliterated in a second. The world was deafening. Cameron knelt beside him, her hands hovering, unsure if she should touch him. Gabriel looked up at her, tears streaming down his face, a vulnerability he had never shown another living soul. He watched her lips move. But for the first time in his life, he didn't have to read them. A soft, melodic, tremulous frequency echoed directly into his mind, rendering the air between them electric. "Can you hear me, Gabriel?" Her voice resonated, sounding like an angel breaking through purgatory. Gabriel let out a choked, desperate sound, a sob of pure, unadulterated shock. He nodded frantically, but the miracle of sound was violently interrupted. Before Gabriel could process the sheer magnitude of her voice, another sound pierced his new reality. It wasn't beautiful. It was sharp, mechanical, and terrifyingly familiar, even to a man who had never heard it before. Click-clack, the sound of a pump-action shotgun being racked. Gabriel snapped his head toward the bedroom door. Standing in the doorway was Silas, his most trusted bodyguard, aiming a Mossberg 500 directly at Cameron's chest. "I'm sorry, boss," Silas said, his lips moving, his voice a deep, gravelly boom that sent shockwaves of raw terror through Gabriel's newly awakened mind. But Don Vincenzo left strict orders. If Arthur Bennett's bloodline ever resurfaced, they are to be eliminated. The mechanical, grinding rack of the shotgun was a sound Gabriel had never experienced. Yet his instincts translated the aggressive frequency instantly. It was the sound of impending death. For 30 years, Gabriel's reaction time had been honed by visual cues and tactile vibrations. But sound, raw, unfiltered, immediate sound traveled faster than a shadow. As the traitorous bodyguard aimed the heavy barrel of the Mossberg 500 at Cameron's chest, Gabriel didn't think. He simply erupted. With a guttural roar that tore through his own newly awakened ears, Gabriel launched his massive frame across the space separating them. He didn't reach for the man. He reached for Cameron, tackling her by the waist. Boom! The shotgun discharged. To Gabriel's virgin auditory cortex, the blast wasn't just loud, it was catastrophic. It felt as though a grenade had detonated directly inside his skull. The acoustic shockwave blew out the bedside lamp and shattered the expensive bottle of Macallan on the nightstand. The air was instantly sucked from the room, replaced by the acrid, burning hiss of gunpowder. Gabriel and Cameron hit the hardwood floor hard, rolling behind the solid oak mass of the king-sized bed. Gabriel clamped his hands over his ears, his vision swimming, a high-pitched, agonizing ring piercing his brain. He was completely disoriented. The sensory overload paralyzed his usually lethal reflexes. "Gabriel!" Cameron's voice cut through the ringing. She was gripping his face, her eyes wide with terror but fiercely focused. She understood what the device was doing to him. She quickly reached to the titanium node behind his ear and twisted a tiny dial. Instantly, the deafening roar of the world dialed back into a muffled, manageable hum. "I lowered the sensory intake," she breathed, her voice a frantic whisper. "We have to move. He's pumping another shell." Gabriel blinked, the fog clearing from his eyes. The vulnerability of the moment vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating fury of the sovereign of New York. This was his territory. This was his penthouse. And someone had just tried to execute the only person who had ever handed him a miracle. He heard the heavy boots of the guards stepping forward, the floorboards groaning under the weight. Gabriel didn't need to look. He could hear the exact trajectory of the man's approach. Gabriel signaled Cameron to stay down. He slid silently toward the foot of the bed, his hand sweeping over the carpet until his fingers brushed the cold, smooth grip of the ceramic combat knife he had tossed aside earlier. The guard rounded the corner of the bed, the shotgun raised. But Gabriel wasn't where the man expected him to be. Rising from the floor like a striking viper, Gabriel drove the ceramic blade upward, bypassing the Kevlar vest and burying the knife deep into the vulnerable juncture of the guard's neck and collarbone. The man's eyes bulged. The shotgun clattered to the floor with a heavy thud. Gabriel twisted the blade, silencing the betrayer forever, before letting the massive body collapse onto the Persian rug. Gabriel stood, panting, his chest heaving. He looked down at his hands, slick with blood. He listened. He heard the blood dripping from the blade. He heard his own ragged breathing. And then, he heard something far worse. Down the hallway, the elevator dinged. A frantic clamor of voices and heavy footfalls echoed through the corridor. Lorenzo, Gabriel's underboss, was shouting orders. "Lock down the penthouse. The Dawn's contingency is in effect. If the girl activated the device, Gabriel is compromised. Kill them both." Gabriel's blood ran cold. The Don's contingency. His father, Vincenzo, hadn't just hidden the cure. He had poisoned the entire syndicate against his own son. Vincenzo had convinced the High Table that if Gabriel ever gained his hearing, the sheer sensory shock would drive him insane, making him weak and unfit to rule. Lorenzo, power-hungry and ruthless, was using this dead man's decree to stage a coup. "They're coming," Cameron whispered, scrambling to her feet and grabbing the steel briefcase containing her father's research. Gabriel grabbed the dropped Mossberg 500, checking the chamber. He looked at Cameron, his dark eyes burning with a promise of absolute violence. He didn't need to use sign language. He didn't need to read her lips. "Stay behind me," Gabriel said. His own voice sounded alien to him, deep, gravelly, and resonant with undisputed authority. Cameron shivered at the raw power of it. She nodded, clutching the briefcase to her chest. Gabriel kicked open the bedroom door. The hallway was swarming with Lorenzo's men. For years, they had relied on Gabriel's deafness to flank him, using flashbangs and visual distractions to blind him. They expected a disoriented, terrified man. Instead, Gabriel stepped into the corridor and fired. The roar of the shotgun was deafening, but this time, Gabriel leaned into the sound. He used it. He heard a man reloading behind a marble pillar. He heard the squeak of tactical boots flanking him from the left. His lack of hearing had made him a master tactician. The addition of sound made him a god of war. He tore through the corridor, a relentless force of nature, protecting Cameron with his own body. Every gunshot, every scream, every shattering pane of glass painted a vivid, three-dimensional map of the battlefield in his mind. They reached the private stairwell. Gabriel shoved Cameron through the fire door, providing covering fire until the Mossberg clicked empty. He tossed the weapon aside, drawing a sleek Sig Sauer from a fallen guard. They descended 70 flights of stairs in a grueling, blood-soaked marathon. Gabriel's mind was swimming, the sensory input threatening to short-circuit his brain, but the soft, terrified, yet steady breathing of Cameron right behind him kept him tethered to reality. When they finally burst into the subterranean parking garage, the cold, damp air of the New York night hit them. Gabriel hotwired a nondescript sedan from the staff parking pool. As they tore out of the garage, the tires screaming against the concrete, Gabriel looked in the rearview mirror. His empire was swarming with traitors. He had lost his throne. But as Cameron reached over, her small, warm hand gripping his blood-stained arm, Gabriel realized he had gained something infinitely more powerful. For 3 weeks, the undisputed king of the New York underworld became a ghost. Gabriel and Cameron vanished into the labyrinth of the city, taking refuge in an abandoned, subterranean subway maintenance station in Brooklyn. It was a brutal, gritty environment, vibrating with the constant, thunderous passing of the Q train. But to Gabriel, it was a sanctuary. Here, in the dim, flickering light of emergency bulbs, Gabriel learned to live again. The transition was agonizing. The neural acoustic transducer was a miraculous piece of technology, but Gabriel's brain required intense, exhausting rewiring. Cameron became his tether, his teacher, and his savior. "Focus on my voice," she would whisper during the worst of his sensory overload attacks, when the dripping of water sounded like hammer strikes and the distant traffic roared like a jet engine. She would sit cross-legged on a ratty mattress opposite him, holding his hands. "Isolate the frequency. Tune out the rust. Find my voice." Gabriel would close his eyes, trembling with the effort. And slowly, the chaotic noise of the world would fall away, leaving only the soft, melodic timbre of her words. "I hear you," he would say, his voice growing smoother, more confident with each passing day. In the shadows of the underground, their dynamic shifted. She was no longer the quiet maid from the Sterling agency, and he was no longer the untouchable, silent boss. They were two outcasts, bound by a legacy of blood and a stolen cure. The intimacy of their survival bred a fierce, undeniable passion. One night, after a grueling session of phonetic exercises, Gabriel pulled Cameron close. He traced the line of her jaw, his eyes dropping to her lips. He didn't need to read them anymore, but he wanted to taste them. When he kissed her, it was desperate and consuming. He could hear the sudden, sharp hitch in her breath, He could hear the frantic rhythm of her heart racing against his chest. For a man who had lived his entire life in a silent void, the sound of Cameron surrendering to him was the most exquisite symphony he had ever known. But the underground couldn't hold them forever. Lorenzo was tearing the city apart. He had placed a $10 million bounty on Gabriel's head, framing him for the massacre at the penthouse. Lorenzo was consolidating power, preparing to meet with the heads of the 5 families at an exclusive, heavily fortified warehouse in the meatpacking district to be crowned the new Don. "He thinks I'm broken," Gabriel said, loading magazines with armor-piercing rounds, the metallic snick-snick of the bullets sliding into place a satisfying rhythm. "He thinks the noise of the world has driven me mad." Cameron watched him, her heart aching with a mixture of fear and awe. Gabriel was no longer the man she had met in the penthouse. The paranoia was gone. The rigid, silent isolation had vanished. He moved with a terrifying grace, completely in tune with his environment. "What are you going to do?" she asked, handing him a tactical vest. Gabriel strapped the vest on, checking the neural node behind his ear. He adjusted the volume dial, turning it all the way up. "I'm going to crash the coronation," he said smoothly. The warehouse in the meatpacking district was a fortress. Lorenzo had stationed dozens of heavily armed men at every entrance. Inside, the massive, cavernous space was filled with long banquet tables, crystal decanters, and the most dangerous men in the city. Lorenzo stood at the head of the table, raising a glass to toast his impending reign. "To the new era," Lorenzo boomed, his voice echoing off the corrugated steel roof. "An era of strength, unhindered by the weaknesses of the past." Suddenly, the massive steel roll-up doors at the front of the warehouse didn't just open, they blew off their tracks in a shower of sparks and blinding smoke. Before the smoke could clear, the lights in the warehouse cut out, plunging the room into pitch blackness. Panic erupted. Men shouted, drawing weapons, firing blindly into the dark. But Gabriel didn't need the light. He moved through the chaos like a wraith, with his hearing enhanced to a superhuman degree by Dr. Bennett's device. The dark warehouse was illuminated by sound. He heard the panicked breathing of a guard to his left crack. A suppressed shot took him down. He heard the distinctive click of a safety being disengaged above him on the catwalk. Bang. A perfectly aimed shot eliminated the sniper. Gabriel was a predator, executing a flawless, rhythmic dance of death. Lorenzo's men were dropping one by one, terrified by an invisible phantom who seemed to know their every move before they made it. "Shoot him! Find him!" Lorenzo screamed, his voice cracking with panic, completely losing his composed facade. The backup generators kicked in, flooding the warehouse with harsh, fluorescent light. The remaining bosses and guards froze in sheer terror. The floor was littered with Lorenzo's elite men, and standing at the far end of the long banquet table, completely unscathed, was Gabriel Moretti. He didn't look like a broken man. He looked like the devil himself. Lorenzo raised his weapon, his hands shaking violently. "You're a freak, Gabriel. Vincenzo knew it. You're compromised." Gabriel didn't rush. He walked slowly down the length of the table. He listened to the terrified, rapid heartbeats of the men in the room. He listened to the rattling of Lorenzo's gun. "My father," Gabriel said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the cavernous space, smooth and lethal, "kept me in the dark because he was afraid of what I would become if I could hear his lies. You, Lorenzo, relied on my silence to steal my throne." Lorenzo fired. Gabriel sidestepped, the bullet grazing the sleeve of his coat. Before Lorenzo could pull the trigger again, Gabriel drew his weapon and fired a single, deafening shot. The bullet struck Lorenzo dead center. The usurper collapsed, his body crashing into the table, shattering the crystal decanters. Silence descended on the warehouse. Not the suffocating, empty silence Gabriel had known all his life, but the stunned, terrified silence of a room full of dangerous men holding their breath. Gabriel looked at the remaining bosses. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "The throne is mine," Gabriel declared, the absolute authority in his tone, leaving no room for debate. "Anyone who questions my capacity to rule can join Lorenzo on the floor." Weapons were slowly lowered, heads bowed. The kings of the underworld recognized their true sovereign. Hours later, Gabriel stood on the balcony of his reclaimed penthouse, the blood cleaned away, the empire secured. The city stretched out before him, a glittering sea of lights and endless sound. Sirens wailed in the distance. A helicopter chopped through the night sky. The low, steady hum of traffic resonated in his chest. Cameron stepped onto the balcony, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. He leaned back into her embrace, covering her hands with his own. "It's loud," she whispered softly, resting her cheek against his back. Gabriel turned around, pulling her against him. He looked down into the eyes of the woman who had brought him back from the dead. The woman who had given him the world. "It is," Gabriel smiled, leaning down to capture her lips. "But your voice is the only thing I'll ever truly listen to." Did this jaw-dropping twist leave you speechless? Gabriel and Cameron's story proves that sometimes the most dangerous secrets are hidden in plain sight, and true power comes from the one who dares to break the silence. If you loved this intense, pulse-pounding Mafia romance, don't forget to hit that like button. Share this incredible story with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more thrilling, dramatic tales every week.